Welcome back to the CTO Playbook, the podcast dedicated to helping CTOs excel. In this episode, I'm speaking with Ritavan about his fascinating journey from being told he wasn't smart enough for maths at school to becoming a pioneering expert in machine learning and a published author. We explore the principles behind his new book, Data to Impact, which offers a playbook for creating real business value through data. The book targets legacy industries, but the lessons are quite universal. If you're ready to learn about avoiding complexity traps, leveraging unique advantages, and aligning your team for maximum impact, then stay tuned. This episode is packed full of insights you don't want to miss. I'm your host, Adam Horner. As a coach for CTOs from startups to enterprises, I empower tech leaders to escape the cycle of lurching from crisis to crisis and build the skills to lead with confidence, clarity, and purpose. I provide practical, personalized coaching tailored to the challenges faced in the organization, helping each CTO shift from reactive problem solving to proactive strategic leadership. I help each CTO forge their own path for growth, allowing them to delegate confidently, align engineering with the business, and fully step into their role as a trusted, respected peer at the executive table. This podcast enables me to bring some awesome playbooks to you and the many CTOs that are looking to broaden their knowledge base. Between me and my guests, we cover valuable topics for CTOs, providing insights, strategies, and practical advice to help you build and refine your own playbook so that you can excel as a CTO. Keep listening to learn why military history is so important for those legacy businesses and the data that lead to impact. Thank you for joining me, Ritavan. It's really fantastic to have you here.
Thanks, Adam. Great to be on.
Now, you've got a very interesting background, and we'll come to your book in a little bit, but it'd be really great to hear a little bit about you, where you've come from, and some of the things that you've worked on up until, getting to this point.
Yeah, sure. I think early childhood really shapes you, and I was kind of curious kid in an alternative school. And so I got to really max out on my curiosity very early on, which was very nice because it kind of helps you get a broad and wide foundation, but will also let me, as a teenager, not being sure where I wanted to go. And so I just went about it first principles. I read up a lot of biographies and figured out that if I studied math, I would kind of keep all doors open because in theory, you could do physics and computer science, etc. I even found a couple of politicians who studied math. So I said, okay, I can really go anywhere from here. And and so I went on to kind of major in math with a couple of minors, in physics and in philosophy and global studies. And
right, but you chose maths in order to not get pigeonholed. That's really fascinating.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. That was the idea. And I mean, to kind of get the emotional driver in, what also happened was when I was 15, one of my math teachers said that I was not smart enough to do math, and I was like, okay, let's let's prove her wrong. So
it's a surprisingly strong theme among high achievers. Somebody tells you can't, right? I'm going to be determined to prove you that I can.
Yeah, and actually, I was the only guy I think from my class to go on to do a master's in math after that. So QED, no more, nothing. But yeah, so it's actually in my master's that I ended up with a scholarship at the École Normale Supérieure Paris-Saclay. It's kind of a very elite research institute in Paris. And I was in a class of about 19 people, all of them from the top prep schools in France. And that's when I realized that kind of my journey into the field was very different from others. It's like I had classmates, who kind of were passionate about it since they were 7, and I don't know, were listening to rhythm and patterns in church bells, or I don't know what, that's the caliber of classmates I had, and that was fantastic. I think it was very hard the first year. And the second year, I wanted to specialize in quant finance because I was in high school when the great financial crisis happened. But given that I struggled in the first year and my grades weren't the best, the head of the math department suggested I join the program within the master specialization within the institute, and that happened in a field called machine learning, of which I'd never heard of. And this is the year 2015, so ImageNet kind of happened about, let's say, 6 to 12 months before that. And AlphaGo with DeepMind was about to happen a year later. And so it was just being in the right place at the right time. And it so happens this master's specialization, the M2 MBA, was founded in 1996 or something like that. So it was a very pioneering program designed for research in signal processing, in machine learning, in computer vision, long before it became trendy and a hype.
Yeah, it's well ahead of its time then, from that perspective.
It was founded, I think, by Robert Azencott. And it was a multidisciplinary program because by its very nature, when you're building mathematical models on data, that data can come from anywhere. So we had courses specialized on remote sensing and satellite imagery. We had courses on, neurobiological data, so neuroscience, and also animal brain signals or whatever, right? So it was a very vast diversity of kind of data types to choose from on the applied side.
And all those ones you've mentioned tend to come in very large volumes of data as well.
Yeah, exactly. And we also had some foundational courses because at the end of the day, there are certain fundamental mathematical foundations that you would need irrespective of what you're trying to solve. What really attracted me to math all through was this ability to think from first principles, to derive a set of axioms, like to build kind of this layer of abstraction that allows you to solve a real world problem in the best possible way. And by chance, I ended up in this space exactly when it was taking off in Europe. And so I graduated 2016, deep mind with AlphaGo. Everyone's excited. I'm super excited. I kind of go back to my original plan. I do an internship at Societe Generale, the French corporate investment bank.
Yeah,
I remember the interview was fun. I spoke with the global head of data science who told me we basically got two topics. There's one topic which is, very kind of established. It's kind of, finding kind of outliers and, detecting outliers in some kind of data, etc. There's a lot of, best practices, a lot of theory around this. It's just a question of implementing it. The second thing was similarly well scoped. And then he said, there's this third thing I don't want to talk to you about because we don't even really know what we want to solve. And then I said, if you offer me an internship, that's the one I want to be working on. And so that's kind of been, I think, a passion of mine is like, running where the fire is, like going exactly there. So running away from regularity and trying to find
from easy
where there isn't, where initially a priori there isn't much. So scoping problems, I think, and I think that will continue to remain a human skill because when you scope a problem, then you can throw data and compute and everything else at it, to optimize it. But scoping problems, real world problem is something I really enjoyed all through.
Cool. And so what were the sort of kind of real world challenges that you were actually facing up against when you first started working for SocGen then?
So on multiple levels, I think when you see a pattern in the data, the sources could be varied. Sometimes it could be just a problem in the data. The other thing could be there could be a system problem, for example. So like technical issues that result in patterns that you see in the data. It could be either human error or active, human manipulation. So if you have a trader, trying like a rogue trader trying to mess stuff up, etc., right? Or it could be something that's legitimate and that's changed in the market. And I think that's the challenge anyone working in the real world with data is going to face, is that you're not working on a static, kind of cleaned up, idealized data set. You're going to have to deal with issues that are out of your control, right? So it's like you're operating in an open-ended system. It's not a well-defined closed system. And
was there Societe Generale that had a very real problem with a rogue trader at some time?
Yes, that was kind of the folklore you would hear in the cafeterias. It was a couple of years ago, a couple of years before I joined it, but I think it was Jérôme Kerviel, and it was a big scandal. And so that was the first thing you were told, hey, look, this is what happened here. It should never happen again. And and then I ended up in, and then I kind of wanted to own P&L. And I think these are these two things that kind of shaped my life, which was impact and, owning impact, owning the P&L basically. And on the other side, this thing of kind of going there, where like running towards the fire and trying to scope out and figure out things that are not being scoped out and figured out properly. And yes, I was a trader in the energy markets. I think I got to own P&L from day one. That was a fantastic experience.
Wow.
And then I moved on to consulting. And then like at a larger consulting firm. And then I got the opportunity to build up the operating practice of a VC in the real estate technology space. And so I got to work with founders. I got to work with founders at multiple stages. So, pre-seed, seed, post Series A, post Series B. And that was an environment I really enjoyed because it's very raw. Like, even if you're not an internal employee, you really have to deliver results, because you cannot sweet talk your way through this, because it's just, you're in the kitchen, right? You're cooking, the heat is on, there is nowhere to hide. And
in those early stages of sort of scaling and setting up all the way through to Series B, those are sort of the critical time phases of a startup, aren't they? So
yeah, exactly. And I think if you leverage things correctly at that stage, those things pay off for years later on. And then I kind of wanted to also experience scale, and I worked at a large industrials company that then had a revenue of 1.3 billion or something, selling high-end tooling around the world. And the nice thing there was also to see kind of the traditional sources of data in a company like this. So you have product and engineering. So I got to work with engineering, co-author my first international patent, with 3 other people for an IoT device. It should hit the market soon. The production cycles are just much longer in hardware.
Yeah.
And especially since if they're applied, I don't know, in the aerospace industry or in the automotive industry, I think the standards for putting something into production are very high, thankfully. And so the product, also the product. So that was the engineering side. The product side was a portfolio of over 120,000 tools. So with the complexity that comes with that, with the specialization of tool categories, etc. Then an omni-channel sales and marketing org. So data from field sales, from inside sales, from e-commerce and web shops, etc. So it was that kind of big diversity of distribution channels. And the third thing then, of course, was a very complex supply chain and operations. And that was a wonderful experience. But also a very.
So your role there was around sort of optimization, was it? Or what was the sort of the actual tangible results you needed to generate?
So it was really dependent on the objective. So one of the objectives,
right,
was to kind of solve this IoT problem, and so that ended up in a patent. It ended up with will end up as a physical product soon that you will be able to buy at a pretty high price tag. Like, it's not something you and me would buy. It's a workstation. This is something you would buy if you were Airbus or Boeing or whatever, right?
Right. Okay.
W or yeah. So that's one kind of problem. Another problem was, for example, forecasting revenue globally. Very different problem, very different kind of user for this. So the diversity of problems was very large, which is why I really enjoyed this. But I think what I regretted was the low growth rates. I think these kind of legacy businesses, the industrial sector just grows at a much lower rate than the startups that I was used to. And then a former client reached out, whom I had kind of worked with at the pre-seed stage, and they wanted me to join as the first non-founder C-level exec, as CTO, to kind of scale the platform. And of course, I couldn't say no to that. And so, yeah. And so
that was your first introduction to the C-suite, then, was it?
Yeah, officially, yes. And that was really fun. And I think since then I've decided I want to operate I want to be in the room where decisions are made, just because I think I can really bring the most value there. Because what I've also observed is that in the last 10 years, I've seen the tech stack evolve at a phenomenal rate. I've seen the tooling change. I've seen trends come and go. As I joke in the book, I wrote an entire book on data impact without really trying to use the term AI, because I've seen the commonly accepted consensus definition of AI change half a dozen times in my career so far. And so
yeah,
I kind of don't want to go anywhere close to that hornet's nest. I think throwing around terms that are not really defined, where there isn't really a consensus, are not rigorously defined, is just meaningless. And I think what really fascinated me here, especially kind of given these two tendencies I had, right? On one hand, kind of trying to formulate problems that are not properly scoped or whatever, right? Sort of squeezing regularity out of entropy or chaos or whatever. And on the other hand, this tendency of wanting to own the P&L. And I think that kind of fused together over the last couple of months when I decided to write this book on data impact. And the objective is really to say what kind of foundational principles should anyone keep in mind when they're trying to achieve real impact, data, business impact, customer impact, whatever you want to call it, in a business setting. And I specialized it to legacy businesses because I think there's so much content, for software businesses and SaaS, etc. There's a lot of really good content out there. And I said, my background has been in legacy businesses, in banking, in energy, in real estate, in industrials. So I wanted to bring that perspective to bear. And yeah, so that kind of book kind of coalesced all of these experience, like a decade of operating in the field across different industries, across different roles, from a data scientist to more senior to a lead data scientist to, acquiring and delivering projects end to end with the team, to being in a product owner role and scaling multiple, developing from scratch or scaling multiple products at scale, to then a CTO role. And kind of all of this culminates in this book.
And I've been very fortunate to get an early copy and an early view of it. So thank you very much for that. I think one of the things that really struck me as I went through it is, number one, that it's really well structured and well organized. And I think the other thing is that almost everything in there, I mean, when you said you were talking about starting about looking at things from first principles, that really struck me because that comes through as a theme all the way through the book. And so I think one of the first areas, and we'll go through the sections in order. I think one of the first things that really struck me was you talk about avoiding groupthink as sort of the headline of it. But then what you really talk about in that chapter is basically starting from the first concepts of what it is that you're trying to do or the problem that you're trying to solve. And that is that something that you find is a real problem endemic with these established legacy companies?
Yeah, I think there are multiple reasons. So one of the reasons is that legacy companies are structurally born in the industrial paradigm. And the way I would define the industrial paradigm is really, fixed costs of replication, fixed costs of personalization for whatever product or service, whatever you're trying to offer. And when you move into the digital age, suddenly your replication costs almost go to zero. Your personalization cost probably might still be constant or high. And once you move into the data-driven digital paradigm, now suddenly your replication costs go to zero, your personalization costs start going to zero. And so it's a very different value creation paradigm. And so you need to really go back to first principles and say, what's who's my customer and what's my value proposition? So I think that's kind of one pillar that's very important. The other pillar is there's a phenomenal amount of talent today working in enterprise sales, working in consulting, that's out there trying to sell you technology. And as I argue in the book, no one got rich spending. If you really want to win, you need to build technology. You need to build it. You need to own it. You cannot kind of consume your way to wealth, to success. And I think that's the kind of the P&L part, which is super important. Is and there's this very interesting anecdote from Charlie Munger. I think it was someone rushed in and said, hey, I think they've got a lot way more efficient machines for mills, for textile mills, and Berkshire Hathaway owned textile mills back then. And Charlie Munger was like, let me first check if it's true. Or I think it was Warren Buffett who said, let's figure out if it's true. And if it's the case, then we exit the business. Because when there is a new technological tool that's, let's say, that's superior and markedly better, then there are two groups of people who are going to win. The people selling the tool, right? And the consumer using the end product. As the person in between, right? The producer, like the person originally making the product, your margins are going to get squeezed because now someone else can buy the machine and produce it cheaper, which will force you to also buy the machine or, find ways to produce cheaper, and that's going to squeeze your margin. And so my argument is you need to first accept this reality of the market, right? You need to understand the fundamental change in the value creation paradigm, right? And based on that, you need to start thinking about how you create value for your customer.
So understanding the unique aspect of whatever it is in your business that you have that is not replicatable.
Exactly. And the word I use for that is leverage, right? So leverage is a commonly used kind of, or like, let's say leverage is used in different fields. So in finance, it's about saying, okay, it's about, let's say, putting a layer of credit on to maximize returns, etc. But the overall, in physics, and if you go back to Archimedes, the idea is, you put it at the right pressure point with the fulcrum and you can lift more weight, etc. And leverage in this sense, in the data-driven paradigm, is really figuring out how can you, with a fixed amount of input, how can you maximize the output you get out? And so it's something that, something I discuss in the book, and, the multiple opportunities and multiple sources of leverage that I highlight, and kind of focusing on that leverage is what matters. The activities and, all the other effort and things you do don't really matter if you can do something low leverage beautifully and it's not going to bring you anything. And so I think accepting that fact right at the outset is super important.
Right. And I think once you've figured out what it is that is your leverage and you have worked out that you're going to put your efforts into that, the next challenge is something that I see with all the businesses that I work with, all the people that I coach, which is, well, how do you get everybody behind that idea rather than it just being you, with your maximum leverage, maximum power on that lever, but everybody else is, off doing something else that they used to do that has basically a equal in, equal out kind of situation.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, if you think of leverage as having, been identifying kind of the bullseye, then sharpening the tip of your spear and kind of putting all the force you have on that one point is what matters. And that's the role of alignment, right? And who better to learn from than the military, right? These are very high stakes situations where the cost of error is death. And I think I use a lot of anecdotes and examples. Also, kind of just being a history buff, I like to take high stakes scenarios to get ideas across, because that's the most intense, that's the max you can kind of, turn up the heat. And so I think it comes back to this idea of, run as close to the fire as possible to figure out what's going on. And alignment is super critical. And that's very interesting because people think, to get aligned, we need to tell everyone exactly what you need to do. And it's actually the other way around. Alignment is about really it's about being very clear where you want to get and how, and like in what circumstances or in which, what kind of operating structure you're allowed to get there. And once this is defined in a crystal clear way, you empower people to do stuff. And I think that's super important, right? And then the data layer comes in is, where you can really start tracking these things and using these things to kind of guide and orient, a whole bunch of teams to achieve that.
Yeah. And I think there was two things that fascinated me about reading through that section. One of them is, as you pointed out, there's a lot of really, really good analogies through the book, but I think there's a surprising number of military references. And for me, who's also a bit of a history buff and also somebody I've worked with the military, I've worked with the British military. And so I've got this great respect for them and for the history of warfare. And so I found that the number of sort of analogies you use from military or especially historical military context was quite impressive. But now that you explain it as, where are the stakes, the most enlightening from the point of view of getting it wrong, it makes it clear to me what that was. But I think the other thing that was fascinating about there was actually using data. And you had quite a good, like a little framework in there about alignment, which I quite liked. Can you just quickly talk us through that bit? Because I think that was something super relevant, even in small teams.
Which one, around commander's intent or?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So I think I love the idea of commander's intent, because I think what happens very often where people focus on process and rituals is because they haven't clearly articulated why something is being done, right? The intent, and the intent not just in terms of like a woo-woo kind of why, but really what do we want to achieve? What's the concrete outcome? What environment are we operating in? What are we allowed to, what are the red lines we shouldn't cross, right? What are what is the framework that allows us to decide what trade-offs to make in the execution? So I think, just like a special forces mission, right? When, you cannot kind of freeze when you're trying to free an aircraft from hijackers, you cannot suddenly press pause and speak to your manager and be like, oh, what do I do now? Right? There are bullets flying around. So you need to make split-second decisions. And so I think having clarity is the only way to do that. And I kind of tried to do a workshop for myself to figure out my values, and the three things that came out were clarity, courage, and impact. And I think clarity is super important, and then you have to marry that with courage. So you need to have clarity around what you want to do. Let's say, kind of freeing a plane from hijackers. And the next thing is courage. Now you have to be willing to go and, run into the bullets, right? And then you will get impact. I think if you kind of do these three things, you need to have clarity, you need to align that to something, and then you will get the outcomes. And the nice thing about having a framework like this is, if you look at the military, right, you have different, completely different kinds of organizations. So you have, the kind of land army, you have the Navy, you have the Air Force, you've got all these other hybrid units, you've got specialized units, etc. And if they have a kind of, decision-making alignment operating system, right, and it allows them to align, then, then getting your product and your marketing team to be aligned shouldn't be that hard, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, isn't it? If a larger organization has already figured it out and is able to make it work, then it should definitely work for you, whether you're a startup or, Series B plus or wherever you are. And especially for as you say, for legacy businesses, which are also of that kind of scale and complexity that you find with the forces, then the commander's intent approach should definitely work. And I also loved your counterexample of when it doesn't work, which is essentially when you're saying, okay, here's the process. Run through this process and just do these things in order, and then it will work, which is a kind of a voodoo if you don't understand when you should deviate from that and what the overall actual intent is going to be of the outcome. So I found that really clarifying in terms of an approach there. The other thing that you then mentioned as we get through the book was that, we tend to put these processes in place. We tend to make sort of structures around things because they feel safe. But that can often lead to excessive complexity.
Yeah. And I think when you have these paradigm shifts, right, in value creation, I think that kind of environment is very rife for, layering on complexity. So there's excellent work by Joseph Tainter on this. And what he kind of tried to figure out is, why civilizations collapsed. And he studied half a dozen different civilizations across time. And he tries to kind of apply complexity theory and energy economics, etc., to figure out what is happening. And I think the thing with the thing to understand about complexity is that no one's producing or adding complexity for the sake of adding complexity. Complexity is born through problem solving. What that means is you have a system, let's abstract out anything that you're trying to study is a system. When there's a problem in that system, a small problem somewhere, someone's going to sit down and try to solve it. And so think of it like, putting on a Band-Aid, right? Or putting on some Scotch tape or something somewhere, right? And over time, all these things, and if you want to use actually code example, right, it's like when you do a bug fix and you don't know the bug fix, and at some point you need a refactoring, right? And that's
exactly the analogy I was going to draw, actually, is when you get to that point, okay, we've got all this, incremental layered on solutions, and now we need to basically simplify it back down to its basics. And that is, as you say, it's the refactoring. And sometimes it's not just code refactoring, but sometimes it's concept refactoring as well, isn't it?
100% an objective refactoring, like what are you trying to achieve with that code, right? And that
right.
And so it's not just a technical refactoring, and that's why I mean, I think for all CTOs listening, it's great if you can do technical refactoring, but if the objective changes, right, and your alignment has changed to something new, then you have to understand all of that and refactor for that objective, right? And so you're really a frontline. You're very much at the front line of value. You have to be very much at the front line of value creation to be able to do that successfully. And so complexity is born out of problem solving. No one creates complexity. Very rarely does someone explicitly create complexity for the joy of creating complexity, and yet complexity can kill you. And I just see this typical example is in public services in government. You have 4 different departments of the government involved in, getting your ID made or getting your company registered or whatever. And what happens is everyone says, oh, we need digital government. And now each of these departments creates a portal of their own, a website of their own. And now you have to log into 4 different websites, say 4 different passwords. And then you go yeah, but the whole point was to set up a company. Why can't we work backwards from there and just design a simple, straightforward system that solves that, instead of taking the legacy organizations and the legacy structures and the legacy tech stack and then kind of just adding a layer of, of digital kind of peanut butter on top. And I think that's kind of what I try to get across here is stop layering peanut butter, because people are already layering peanut butter all over, right? And so you need to take a step back and really say, what are you trying to once you figured out what you're trying to achieve, once you've aligned everyone to that, now cut out the fluff. Because if you don't cut out the fluff, you're going to have these, to use a biological analogy, you have this, your metabolic rate is too high. You're going to, it's just inefficient. And to go back to energy economics, I think Denter uses the collapse of the Roman Empire, and at some point, just the cost of running the machine is so high that it breaks the machine down, and you totally want to avoid that. And it's so complete, and it is avoidable, and it has to be, kind of kept in mind and executed on. Because if you don't do that, it will inevitably lead to collapse. There is no auto-correcting mechanism, because auto-correcting mechanism is the problem, right? You're constantly putting band-aids and bug fixing.
Yeah, and I think the key thing about that is that it's refactoring at multiple different levels of abstraction all the time. It's from the detailed part of the system all the way out to the macro system itself. There's nothing more clarifying that than seeing how a civilization collapses. It's sort of the biggest system we know of, really, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. And it happens everywhere, right? And you experience it, and then when you're a customer or user of a complex system like this that's gone wrong, I think that's when it hurts the most. And again, back to Peter Drucker and why there is a business, is because there is a customer, and so always have that empathy, right? There is someone who's going to have to deal with the stuff you're producing, and keep that in mind, right? And feel the pain of that person, and wake up every morning with that pain, because if you do that, you will make sure you don't go into this kind of complexity rabbit hole that leads to collapse.
Or being undercut and undermined by cheaper, faster, nimbler competitors, which often come into marketplaces and do exactly that.
Yeah, exactly.
Which sort of leads us on to the next thing, which is sort of learning and optimizing the approach to learning, because I think that's one of those things that's sometimes pretty hard to figure out. When you're running fast, you've got something that's up and running, you've got something that's constantly changing. So isn't constantly optimizing it also kind of working against the simplification approach to it?
Well, the reason why I speak about simplification first is because you want to take out all the stuff that's not critical to the system, right? Once you're left with what really matters, then, and you know what you want to optimize towards, right? So that's kind of, once you're aligned to what you want to achieve and you've removed the fluff, then you want to max out, because now there is no longer a reason not to max out, right? Because all the stuff that would have been clutter has been removed. And that's why simplification, for me, just conceptually, is super important before you think of optimizing. Because if you start optimizing with clutter, firstly,
you're optimizing for the wrong thing, basically.
You're optimizing, not to say optimizing for the wrong thing. You might not even find the right optimum because it's going to be hidden among clutter, right? And you get rid of clutter so that you can optimize. And you need to optimize with a worldview that's empirically valid. And what that means is you need to know what in your environment, what sources of signal or stochasticity in your environment are useful for you. Sometimes you need to make sure you factor in kind of, the irreducible uncertainty in nature, right? Sometimes you should just accept that some things will be stochastic and design around that. And sometimes you need to say, look, there is a stochasticity within a certain, you can kind of modularize stochasticity and say, look, within that there is stochasticity, but I see regularity at the level of abstraction above that or around that or whatever. And my decision is operating at that level of modularity. And so I don't care if there's stochasticity below, right? And I think this process of building a mathematically optimized model of your world and your environment is super important, because once you have that in place, and it's an iterative process and it's not a one-time process. So I think that's super important to say. It's not as if, just sit down and kind of, sketch it out and then you're done. This is a continuous process, right? But having that...
So that idea of this empirically valid is something that has to change over time as the world changes, and as you say, as new randomness gets introduced into the system.
Yeah, exactly. And as the objectives change, like we said, it came to refactoring also, right? So all these things are changing. And so by having that clarity around building, and I have a quote from Dijkstra, right? Edgar Dijkstra, the computer scientist, and I think it's super important to figure out. A lot of people think abstraction is about, is about kind of having this ivory tower effect and not knowing what's going on. And I think that's something you can do, for example, when you're building an axiomatic theory in math. So you try to postulate axioms, and then everything else is kind of logically derived from those axioms, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when you're solving a real life problem, and that's where I think you're thinking mathematically without you doing axiomatic math, you need to now figure out what are the axioms, right? Like when are those axioms kind of empirically valid? Like, can you prove, can you test, can you experiment to show what is right and what's wrong in a way that's useful to you, right? And so there's that judgment involved there. And I think what is super important here is that the model is empirically valid, right? That means that the assumptions you make are true in the physical world, because you can change a lot of things. There's certain physical elements you just can't change, and so you need to be extremely clear-eyed about that, right? And the second thing is you want to focus on and understand the mechanisms of how these things work together, and how you can use that to achieve your objectives.
Right. So these are helping make sure that you've bounded the problem with valid assumptions at the level of abstraction you're working at then.
Exactly. So, you kind of scope the lemon, and then you want to squeeze the lemon as hard as possible. I think that's also super important, because what happens very often, and that's kind of a evolutionary survival mechanism, and not just in humans, this is being observed in goldfish and pigeons and ants and you name it. And what happens is we're designed evolutionarily to satisfice, and satisficing basically means doing an okay level of output or outcome. So to give you an example, if you, let's say, are hunting for food, right, as a species, then evolutionarily you don't always go and maximize your outcome by going to the one place, let's say, where the density of food is highest, because what if there is a flooding there, or what if there is like a drought or something, and suddenly everything goes to zero, then you die out. And so what happens is evolutionarily species are designed to do just well enough, and not to maximize mathematically to the optimum, but just to do well enough. And also the compute, and I think it's something a lot of people don't realize is, we have a kind of, first it was deep learning and reinforcement learning, and now LLMs, etc. But at the end, what's happening in the background is there's just computers become cheaper, right? You have more compute, you have more data. And so why don't you then leverage that to optimize stuff to the maximum, instead of using heuristics, instead of, doing back of the envelope calculations? Like, there's just so many techniques that are being used today to make decisions day to day that are based on, on computational complexity of 100 years ago. Like, when you didn't have the tooling to be able to compute stuff. But I think it's super important to, squeeze the lemon as so first you want to find the lemon and define the lemon correctly. And then you want to squeeze that lemon as hard as possible, because if it's by squeezing the lemon that you figure that you also fine tune, your definition of the lemon. And I think that's kind of a very important thing to keep in mind, because if you don't squeeze it hard enough, you will never know how hard it can be, how much lemon juice you're throwing away.
Yeah. Okay. Right. So I guess it's worth probably just covering that word quickly, satisficing, because it's an unusual word in English, never mind in any other language, and it's a portmanteau, isn't it? It's a combination of satisfying and suffice, or sufficing, which is to have just enough to be satisfied, essentially shoved into one word.
Exactly.
And so therefore, what you're saying is leave that behind and go for the absolute max. Go for everything you can to get out of that situation, whatever it is.
Yeah. Exactly. And this is, by definition, satisficing is suboptimal. And the thing is, for most of our, for essentially all our evolution, we were not the dominant species on the planet, or nature was completely out of our control. And so not just for us, for all species, for all species even today, right? So in that environment, in what if we use the language of reinforcement learning and bandits, etc., multi-armed bandits, what that means is the environment is adversarial, right? So you cannot make too many assumptions about what's going to happen. I cannot tell you whether there's going to be a drought or a heat wave, 6 months in, or, so these are all things that are outside our control. We cannot compute what's going to happen with the environment. And so in that kind of setting, satisficing is a survival strategy, because if I were to optimize for something and I was wrong, I would be wiped out as a species. And the assumption here is that I can compute, right? Most of the time, for all our history, we couldn't compute. Nature was so complex and hard that we would be praying, right? Because that was the only thing we could do. In a business setting, very often, for a lot of things are really well spec'd out. You don't need to random. You're not in an adversarial environment. You can actually tease out enough regularity to be able to go for an optimal decision. And now compute allows you to do it. Data allows you to do it, right? So it's about thinking
and make the most of it.
Good.
Yeah. Awesome. And that essentially is the step that you call grow. And it's just basically taking what you've learned, the best thing you've got, and then just maximize that out, go for the most of it you possibly can.
Yeah, exactly. It kind of weaves in all of these things, because there's no point weaving all these principles, all these ideas together if you don't want to grow, right? Well, what's the point of doing all of this? And I think that's what, again, this kind of paradigm shift is super important. If you look at the world from the industrial paradigm's point of view, it's all about big capital intensive investments. It's about the supply side, keeping costs under control, being able to supply stuff, etc. And economically speaking, if you look at economic thinkers, right, like from Adam Smith to today, or to, let's say, the early 1900s, the entire focus is all around supply, around how do you, Adam Smith around with the pin factor, etc. Everyone's looking at how can we make things more efficiently. And the reason for that was supply was a problem. Like, just people that, given the demand and what people wanted to consume, there just wasn't enough stuff to go around. And it's only really after the Second World War that you have in certain regions too much stuff, right? And that's when you need to start branding and marketing and all of that, because now suddenly you don't just have a supply problem, you also want to figure out demand. And in some ways, that's why Peter Drucker is so important, because he says a business is not about supply, right? We're not talking of the East India Company, trying to get goods from somewhere, right? We're trying to say, why are those goods there? Because there's a customer. Someone wants to use that thing, right? And I think, and once you move to the digital paradigm, the cost of writing software is not that, it's a one-time fixed cost, right? The cost of replication is essentially zero. And now suddenly the supply constraint is gone, right? In terms of production, you don't have big capital intensive investments, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's so much more now about figuring out the needs of the user, right? What is their problem? How do you solve it? How do you delight them, etc.? And so having that kind of, demand and abundance thinking is super important. So the industrial paradigm is a scarcity-based paradigm structure, right? Historically speaking. And the digital data-driven paradigm is one of abundance. And so if you don't change your mindset, you're not going to be able to win, because, you're trying to cycle on an F1 track, and you don't want to be doing that from a mindset perspective.
Yeah, that's quite a good way of thinking about it from the overall difference is that abundance process, because I think that's something I've seen come up again and again in various different business books elsewhere. But I think your book does a very good, thorough, deconstruction of why the abundance mindset is so critical to making modern businesses work. And I know you've focused the book on legacy businesses have been around in some cases for more than 100 years. In some cases, some of the businesses you're looking at and referencing in the book. But I think as a framework, let's just quickly go through it. So there's SLASOG is the acronym, SLASOG. So you had save money by avoiding the costly groupthink mistakes. You had leveraging the unfair advantage that you've got in the highest impact opportunities you've got available to you. You've got alignment, making sure that everybody and everything is aiming towards that bullseye that you were talking about. We've got the simplification, that's removing all the stuff that's not there, reducing the complexity down, refactoring where we need to from a macro and a micro perspective, optimizing that whole process so that once we've got just what we need to, that's going in the right direction, everything's aligned, that we then basically make sure we're doing the minimum amount in order to get the maximum output, and then grow. And that's basically the squeezing lemon as hard as you can, as you put it.
Yeah, and the purpose, the whole point of doing this is to delight the customer. If you're not, don't even get out of bed, right? Don't bother if you don't want to do that, because that's super important. And the other reason is because, legacy businesses have got used to a growth rate that is, single digit, or lower. The EBIT margins have been squeezed over time. Aviation used to be a super luxury thing, right? I still remember when I was I flew the first time as an unaccompanied minor when I was 3 years old, and it felt really cool. It felt special, perhaps because I was tiny, but everything just felt amazing. It's not the same today, right? There are all these kind of...
It's a complete commodity now these days.
Yeah. Complete commodity, and there are all these studies out there that airlines, most especially full service airlines don't even make money in economy anymore. And more interestingly, if you look at the airline industry overall, there is an argument to be made that with the low single digit EBIT margin, sometimes barely profitable, the enterprise value is negative. Like the value of an airline is the loyalty program, and I think that kind of change in thinking is super important, because what's the loyalty program? The loyalty program is your customers, and your customers that you've got through your legacy business, right? In this case, you're flying them physically from point A to point B. But where you're making money with them is independent of getting them from point A to point B. And I think that completes, and that's what I mean, like moving out of the scarcity mindset, because it doesn't really matter now how many aircrafts you have. You can maximize the value you create for your customers at another, on another layer of abstraction that is data-driven, right? And so your legacy business really is where your customers originally came from, and you're providing them a physical service, right? But the value you can create for them is independent of that, and is just, the sky's the limit there. And I think the more you think that way, the better, because yes, of course, you can optimize your airline operations and try to squeeze out, here and there some, but the sea change is just thinking beyond that.
Yeah, looking at a completely different aspect of the business. And in this case, I mean, airlines is such a good one because it literally is the data that's effectively being turned into a bank, basically.
Exactly. And there are multiple businesses that, that are able to do this. I mean, I have a dozen case studies. There's a whole variety of businesses. If you take the energy grid, right, because I was an energy trader, and the biggest, the whole reason why there is an energy market is because the grid infrastructure has to be maintained at a certain frequency, right? And in this case, I mean, in continental Europe, it was 50 hertz. So you have to make sure that the energy grid is operating, in around 50 hertz with a very thin kind of band around that. And what that means in effect is you need to balance supply and demand in real time. Demand is stochastic, right? You can't ask people to switch off their lights or whatever, right? Or switch off their washing machines. And so demand by its very nature is stochastic and out of control. And the idea earlier, with conventional energy production, so let's say, coal power plants, gas power plants, etc., is you could ramp up or ramp down production. So if demand went up, you just toss a bit more coal in, or let more gas in, produce more energy, etc. And so you have kind of this kind of stochastic, uncontrolled demand curve. And then you build your supply stack, which is in your control. Most of these technologies are in your control. And then you balance supply and demand. And so you ensure you have, you maintain the energy, the grid frequency around 50 hertz for the stability and safety of the grid. As a consumer, you have distribution companies in between that kind of, take the financial risk of doing that. They're traders who, make sure this is happening in real time, etc. But as a consumer, you're completely cut out from this. And one of the case studies in the book is Octopus Energy. And when they come in and say, hey, why should you be cut out and spaced out from all of this? What if we can help you, save money and support the grid? Right. And so you kind of really bring the consumer very close to, you bring the consumer now close to where the fire is, right? You're taking your customer into the, to the pizza oven, right? And then you're just kind of reducing all this other abstraction and costs in between and inefficiencies in between. And I think that's kind of I think that's a trend that any business can kind of latch onto, because it's inevitable. Someone's going to do it. And
it's a great example of simplification as well, where you just take a lot of the stuff that's been built up over years, sometimes decades, as a concept, and just say, well, what happens if we try to invent this without that?
Exactly. What happens if we rethink also, consumption and optimizing consumption? And, so much of our, initially, people were happy if they had one bulb in their room. And I love to travel once in a while and kind of rough it out sometimes. But you go sometimes into environments where people even today, don't have continuous electricity or, 24/7. You have power cuts and load shedding and whatever. And so it's a luxury people get used to. And then, you stop even realizing that there is a supply production mechanism in the background every time you click some gadget, switch on some gadget in your room. And the closer you get to that, we can't really go back to nature in the rawest sense possible, where you wrap leaves around yourselves and kind of, sleep on a tree. But I think technology allows us to get closer to nature in the sense of, getting closer to the source of whatever it is you're consuming. And I think, I think this is something that's kind of just, again, unlocks so much of value.
And it's one of those things that, just to bring the conversation full circle back to where we started, it's one of those things that's only possible due to the amount of data that's collected, used, and actually runs those businesses.
If done correctly, yes. Or you could just, kind of fritter away money on something that has zero impact, right?
And if you think about energy supply and demand, that's something that's happening all the time. And same with airlines as well in many cases.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the other thing. I think you cannot wish away. People get very super excited. Oh, we have this, software, pure software business, etc. And very cool. But the thing is, we're still living in a world of atoms, right? As far as I'm concerned, I'm not living on some, in some virtual world, or I don't know if we ever get there, but for now we're not there. And so I think for the foreseeable future, we're going to live in the world of atoms. And the more we can bring the most rational way of thinking, the best ideas from math and data and compute to solve these problems, the more we think of these problems from first principles, the better. And that's why I kind of try to craft this framework to do just that, to kind of a bit like a dimensionality reduction. Like you want to go down to, your like these are my 6 eigenvectors. That when I try to solve a problem, like how can I say, like, what's there to save? Like, what are the anti-patterns? What are the wicked problems? Like, what are all the stupid things that I should avoid doing? Right. Once I've done that, where's the leverage? Right. What's my unfair advantage? Because if you're Mbappe, you don't want to be playing in the NBA, right? And if you're one of the best NBA players, you would want to be playing in the Champions League. And so you really want to make sure you're playing the game you were designed to win, right? Or you have a unfair advantage at winning. So choose that. Choose your battlefield, right? Like, why do you want to go and fight in someone else's terms? So, choose your battlefield, play to your unfair advantage. So that's leverage. Once you have that, you need to align everything to that, because you might have found your leverage, but if you don't align everything to that, you're not going to be able to win, right? So you need to align to your leverage. And once you've found your leverage and you've aligned to it, then there is a lot of clutter that you can now get rid of without any risk. That's the simplify step. And once you have now your leveraged, aligned, and simplified setup, you're now ready to optimize that setup. And when you optimize that, you can grow. And you have to be willing to admit, acknowledge, and see that there is growth out there. And by growth, I don't mean like, owning your 11th car or something. I mean really some grow in the sense of do something, meaningful out of it that creates value. And you bring that framework together, and you think clearly, you act with courage, and you obsess about impact, and it's going to work. Like, there is no reason why it won't work. It's about 10 really doing it, and fine tuning it while you do it.
As a wonderful summary of the whole thing. Ritavan, it's been really, really fantastic talking to you today. How can people find you, and how can people find the book?
So the book should be out sometime early, the end of March, if I'm very optimistic, but most likely early April. And right. I'm somewhat active on LinkedIn, so you can look me up on LinkedIn. And otherwise, there will always be something under www.ritavan.com, so myname.com. There is a waiting list for the book. So if, these ideas kind of, got you thinking, triggered something, in you, then please go there, sign up. It's, I'm not written this book for the sake of writing this book. I've written this book for you, right? Again, back to, it's not about the supply, it's about, the demand that created from there. And so, and there's nothing more exciting than being able to help someone solve a problem. And so, just go to ritavan.com, join the waiting list. I will keep you informed, and get the clarity, muster your courage, and achieve the impact you deserve.
Excellent. Well, we'll put a link to all of those on the website. Ritavan, it's been fantastic talking to you today. Thanks very much.
Right back at you, Adam. Thanks a lot. It was a lovely conversation.
Thank you very much for listening all the way through to the end. Just before you go, I'd like to ask you for one thing in return for putting together all these episodes of the CTO Playbook podcast for you. Please leave a review. Wherever you're listening, whether that is Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whichever platform you're on, leaving a quick review will help more CTOs find the podcast and enable me to create more great episodes. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode of the CTO Playbook.